So I'm very happy to welcome everybody to this NHLA Technical Services Committee presentation on subject analysis, followed by an Ask a Cataloger session. And my name is Angela Brown at the Amherst Town Library, and I am the chair of the committee.
Hello, I'm Ann Murphy, and I am the webmaster for the committee. How do you do?
Hello, I'm Martha Simmons, and I'm on the committee, and I work at Hooksett Public Library.
And please enter any questions you may have in the chat box, or at the end, just feel free to unmute and ask your question at the end of the presentation. And we'll take questions about the presentation first and then open it up to any other technical services related questions at the end that you might have. So without further ado, I will get us started here with our subject analysis presentation. So, oops, skipped one already. So what is subject analysis anyway? So kind of the theoretical technical term is it's kind of a conceptual analysis to determine what a resource is, its physical form, what a resource is about, its intellectual content or subject matter, and from those things forming an aboutness statement. And an aboutness statement basically just summarizes your understanding of the resource's aboutness, genre, form, concepts, and subject matter. And I have an example, so this will make a little bit more sense in just a minute. And from this, we can then move on to applying or assigning terms and subjects from a controlled vocabulary, such as Library of Congress subject headings, and classification notations, such as from the Dewey Decimal System. So my little example here to explain this is a new book by Paul Hollywood called Bake: My Best Ever Recipes for the Classics. And this book, the resource is a book, so that's this form, and it's about baking, that's its content, and it includes recipes for cakes, cookies, scones, breads, and other baked goods. So that's kind of the subject matter. And from this, we can assign a Dewey Decimal number to it, which is in this case 641.815, which is baked goods. And then Library of Congress subject headings, baking, bread, pizza, and Library of Congress genre form terms, cookbooks, recipes. And I'll hand it over to Anne to go into a little bit more detail about this.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about to give you some idea of how to determine what a work is about, the aboutness thing Angela was just talking about. So for most fiction, it's probably helpful to start reading the publisher's description for ideas. With the publisher's description in mind, you can compare those ideas with the Library of Congress authority file, or compare them with online resources like Goodreads or Novelist for help with headings for similar works. In the next example under nonfiction, it's a good idea to look at the table of contents. In the table of contents, you can look for keywords to search for in your catalog, check the terminology against other catalogs for the same work, and check against your own catalog for similar works of the similar focus. Will help you get ideas of what you can use for heading. Many times you might find similar works from OCLC that help you isolate a topic, especially with qualifiers that include the subdivisions all spelled out. It makes it easier for you to fill them in. You might even discover variations of terms, such as, like in the case of heart disease, people often refer to myocardial fraction. I can't say it. Myocardial infarction, sorry. And that oftentimes is the way that they describe a heart attack. So it would be nice to be able to put that in the way it's written. And for collected works, it may be best to apply broader, narrow headings for a single work. I'm going to be covering that in my next slide. Angela? So steps to subject analysis. So subject analysis, as I say in my slide, is the organizing of information. How do we go about doing that? That's the $1,000 question. Catalogers analyze oftentimes the main subject of a work in order to house related materials together. sort of easier for the patrons to find. As we know, libraries typically shelve histories, sciences, or art materials in their respective areas so patrons can go to that section and find them easily. Can you identify, for example, a general category of a work, its major focus? Well, this is a good time to ask yourself maybe some questions about the content. For example, for the example of what is being discussed, where is the topic being discussed and when? Broad and narrow headings play into this a little bit. So what are those broad and narrow headings? What does that mean? Catalogers try to select a broad heading or a narrow heading, but generally not both in the same record, unless there's a really good reason to do that. A broad heading covers a wider range of topics and may be sufficient on its own, whereas a narrow head sort of narrow down the subject to get really specific and be more explicit, and it may be depending on the material that you're cataloging. Take the heading sports, for example. Now that's a broad heading. In a book about sports, it might be best not to add sports and basketball together in the same record, unless you thought it was really necessary and basketball was at least a third of the quality of the content. Because it would be confusing if the book is about sports and you're having both of them, and it's like, are you searching for basketball or are you searching for sports generally? If, for example, geography, can it be qualified by a geographic location? That would help you with a subject heading, kind of iron it out. So you still have sports, but if geography is part of the concept, then sports can be qualified by location. And I have an example of 200 Years of Sports in America by Wells Twombly. Geography is clearly involved in that particular work. So Sports United States becomes the heading. So you have the next example there, sports in the United States, and you can see how that adds up. And can the topic be further qualified by a time span or a language, for example? In our previous example, the work also included a time span when it said the fuller heading becomes 200 years of sports in America is 200 years of history. So you have sports United States history. So there you can have one broad heading, including all three of those concepts. And it sort of narrows and helps explain the heading, but it doesn't have to be specifically a more narrow heading. It's a broad one. So how many headings are needed in a record? Well, there's not really any hard and fast rule about how many to add. One heading in our sports example can cover a fairly large introductory topic. However, if many topics are identified, try to discern, for example, how extensively they're covered in the work. A rule of thumb I learned a while ago is like the 60-40 rule. If there are multiple headings and there are multiple topics of equal weight, that's one of the questions you want to ask yourself. What's a 60-40 rule? Well, it's basically saying if 60% of the work is covered by one topic and 40% by another, you've got your two headings, you can add two headings, and they can both be broad. Or maybe the rule of thirds will play into that. So, for example, is nothing predominant in that work? If nothing in that particular work predominates, you can do 20% of one thing, 20% of something else, and 20% of the third thing. So you'd basically be using the rule of thirds, where you'd be using something like that. You could either do two broad headings like sports and say diabetes in a work like that, or you could do say something broad and narrow like sports and sports injuries. Believe it or not, that's actually a narrow topic, sports injuries. So these are some of the things you can play with, but you can also say 80 to 20%. I mean, these are just rules of thumb, and you go on your best instincts for determining what is added for those headings. That's basically what we go by. Done?
Hello, I will be talking about controlled vocabularies more specifically. What are they? Why do we need them? One definition from the Library of Congress subject headings online training, which is in the resources section later in the presentation, is that a controlled vocabulary is a standardized subject language used to describe the contents of resources, and they're arranged to describe hierarchical relationships. So why do we need them? Committees are used to select terms to describe concepts with the goal that they'll be broadly understood, and they decide upon preferred terms to help ensure that the vocabulary is consistent, robust, and well-rounded, and to help increase access to the works while reducing bias and confusion. So what about keyword searching, you might be wondering, because keyword searching is very popular and it often gets what you need. A controlled vocabulary might not always include the most colloquial or natural language terminology that one might expect, especially as language and culture changes. So why do we use them? There are benefits to keyword searching, especially when a keyword also could be called an uncontrolled term, is more specific than the associated controlled term in the vocabulary. In that case, the user might end up with more results than they would with a more specific controlled term. But this is also why controlled vocabularies work around that, if you will, by using hierarchies and also linked terminology to aid access for those other terms. Keywords also have limitations. They're often useful for discovery, but they can't cover the complex nature of languages and expressions and context like controlled vocabularies are designed to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about the features on the next slide. So controlled vocabularies, as we said, they exist to aid access, and that they aim to select a standard term, if you will, with which to provide an access point for item discovery. And this maintains consistency across records that share the same topics. Otherwise, there could be several terms that are similar about a single topic, and you wouldn't retrieve all of the results. So a simple example of this would be if a user is looking for general information on dogs, and Anne just mentioned that sometimes you might have a more specific term, like dachshunds, it might only contain that. But for this example, if you're looking just for general dog information, once you know that dogs or puppies are the preferred terms, you can find most works on that subject without having to wonder if you're missing any books that might be under additional terms, such as canine, the letter K-9, or pups, puppers, man's best friend, etc. Another thing that controlled vocabularies do, and do well, is focus searches, especially if one's language contains many synonyms, which English does. As Anne touched on, uncontrolled terms are more likely to be terms that are used in a particular region or an ethnic or cultural group or speakers of various dialects. And these terms are still important, of course, but they're not always beneficial for initial discovery or broad discovery by many people across a large region. So another great example from the Library of Congress training is carbonated beverages. The terms for those, soda, pop, etc., can vary widely depending on where a person is from. So the committees choose terminology that most people would understand and then also link variant forms for added discovery. Finally, controlled vocabularies provide alternate and related terms for cross-referencing, as I just mentioned. So having a controlled vocabulary doesn't mean that no other similar terms can be used or found. These unauthorized terms can be narrower or broader or variant terms, and they're provided as cross-references to enhance searching if a different uncontrolled term is entered by a patron. So also one other thing to note is that because controlled vocabularies do choose these preferred and alternate terms, sometimes a single vocabulary might not have enough in it for an organization might need more specific or tailored terminology. So I have some examples there. I won't go through them all. I've linked to them if you want to check out and learn out more about them. But these are examples of that case where they've added more terminology that's specific to kind of bolster for their catalogs. And finally, I just have an example of how important accurate subject analysis is to discovery. This is kind of summarizing all of what we've been talking about. So in this example, which is the MARC record for The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, we can see how important the subject analysis and by extension, controlled vocabulary is to discovery. Titles might not provide many clues to the content. The Vanishing Half might be a nonfiction work on how to perform illusionary magic tricks, or it could be maybe a dystopian story about how half the world's population suddenly vanished. We can't tell from just the title. Likewise, there may be a description field or not. A description, which is the 520 field on the right-hand side there, that is a valuable but not required bibliographic field. So even if a record contains a description, it also might not be enough to demonstrate important topical information. So if this record had no subject or genre and form headings, or merely minimal ones such as sisters and domestic fiction, we wouldn't have any idea where or when the story was set, or its main themes, or even that it was a work of fiction. And that's the power of subject headings and subject analysis and controlled vocabularies. So the benefits to having the controlled vocabulary and those headings here, particularly I noticed in this record, for the topical term passing identity, since the word passing can have several meanings and various contextual uses, it's necessary to be able to make clear which one is being discussed in this work. So having a preferred term for each concept ensures clarity of concept and also consistency across records.
So I'd like to end this with another kind of higher concept idea of catalogers' judgment and objectivity. So basically, when you're cataloging something, when you're looking at a cataloging record, it's really important to recognize that everyone has a point of view and a bias. We're all human after all. We're all influenced by our own culture, personal experience, political leanings, tastes, and it's important to recognize these, especially when cataloging a work with content that we might disagree with. And also to keep this in mind when looking at subject headings for a work as well. Did the cataloger miss something because they might hold a bias towards the work or lack certain knowledge about it? Catalogers have a lot of power when it comes to assigning subject headings and classification notation. You know, are they intentionally leaving it out, you know, for whatever reason? And although subject analysis can be subjective, every cataloger should strive for objectivity. Again, easier said than done. To help with this, it's, again, good to recognize your own perspective and approach each item equally, and then analyze an item with as much objectivity as possible. There's no real hard and fast rules about this, but some questions that might be helpful to ask are, you know, what was the author's intent? Is this a work of fiction or nonfiction? What is it for? Who is the audience? All of these can be helpful when you're analyzing a work and applying subject headings, as we previously discussed. And Martha made a great point about, you know, controlled vocabularies being, you know, they're developed by committees and, you know, and a lot of those kinds of organizations, LC and such. But it's also important to keep in mind that these organizations also might carry their own biases. You know, Library of Congress is really a North American kind of vocabulary. So a lot of the terms in that, a lot of the subject headings are going to be really focused on kind of a North American perspective. And that's where those alternative vocabularies can come in really handy, because they kind of get to the true kind of, you know, nature of what a work might be about. So that is where we'll end. And then we provide you some resources. So a lot of these are all free trainings. The Library of Congress has some really good ones that kind of go into kind of general subject analysis, but also into, you know, how to apply subject headings as well. And if you want to learn more about the theory, as I'm sure so many do, there's a great chapter in the Organization of Information about subject analysis and kind of the different flavors of it, because there isn't just one way. So that's important to keep in mind. So I'd love to open it up to some questions. So I don't know if there was anything in the chat, but feel free to unmute and ask away. And I'd love to start with anything about this topic in particular, but if you have other technical services questions too, please let us know. And I'm going to stop